Thank you very much, Sonia, and I'm very grateful to be here. And I can also say that it's a delight for somebody who started in this field 25 years ago, as some of the old hands whom I know in the well-being literature and also here will know. 25 years ago, particularly as an economist, if you talk about happiness and well-being, you had to come in with full metal jacket, and still you get out of every room besmirched, and you had to defend yourself for your life. And now we have these wonderful conferences where we're talking about the particulars of well-being and how we can bring it into policy, how times have changed. So it's great to be amongst friends. What I want to talk about today is sort of a part of a much larger project in terms of thinking how we can get well-being, and I'm going to mean by that life satisfaction, and I'm also going to mean by that life satisfaction over the whole life course, so very similar to Years of Good Life that Wolfgang talked about yesterday. How can we actually bring that into the practice of policy making? Now I thought, as probably many of you, that this was going to be easy. All we needed to do was have a big fight about what the best measure of well-being was. And well, once that fight is won by the right people, then we're done, right? Then things would happen in itself and policy would readjust. And I don't know why I was that stupid. But, I mean, that literally was sort of the image I got. And it was because the academics were fighting so hard about the right definition of well-being, and, the 50 indices and this and that. And it didn't occur to me then that that is but the start of a very, very long process. And that, in fact, getting the perfect measure is much less important than really engaging with that whole bloody process. And once that dawned on me, I thought, well, hey, there's something we can sort of try and do. So I'm going to tell you about part of that journey, hopefully of the whole well-being field, to become policy serious, I would say. Right? And I'm going to talk about one of the aspects of the well-being literature and how to bring that into policy land, but just generally trying to make you aware of some of the problems that I wasn't aware of, not even 5 years ago. And so I'm going to talk about standard economic thinking, how that currently influences policy land, and sort of the status effects, the Eastman kind of paradox. You'll all be familiar with that. Well, how do we bring that into standard economic thinking as it informs policy, right? That is a much less trivial question than it seems. And then I'm going to talk about the Eastman discount, which is my suggestion, and sort of named in honor of Richard Eastman. So this all sort of comes from a handbook which we sort of delivered last week. This was for 7 UK departments. They sort of paid us to make this thing. So this talks about how to actually do well-being in policy making. This thing is now in principle freely available, so you can mail me for a copy. And this thing looks at everything to do with well-being policy making. Design, cost effectiveness, the way that Treasury feeds into departments, all kinds of stuff. Now, I want to start with how economics actually informs policy. And I want to start with a table which is not mine, which I got from somebody in UK Heritage. And this thing summarizes so much of what is now standard economic thinking in policy land. And I wasn't aware that all this sort of stuff happened. So what you are looking at is a table made up by the Airport Commission in the UK. It was sort of nominally invited to talk about the Heathrow extension plan by the Department of Trade, but really this is a piece of advocacy. This is a lobbying document, right? And this is their crucial table in which they basically try to show that Heathrow should have another runway. You know that these kind of large airports, Heathrow is the largest airport in the UK, and they've got a couple of runways, 4 or 5 or something, and they wanted another one, right? This is a Swiss-owned company. And the Swiss-owned company pushed research in order to show that, we should have another runway in the UK. And this is sort of the highlight report, right? So I'm going to walk you through this because there are so many assumptions in here that sort of don't make necessary sense, but that are now baked into how we do policy making. And the other thing to note is that it was really on the basis of this that recently the UK has decided, yes, we're going to have another runway. So this is also really how it goes, right? This is sort of from the policy frontiers. And the first thing to say is that you will find this kind of calculations for hundreds of things around the world. You find them for mental health programs in the US, you find them for new curricula in France. This kind of cost-benefit table dominates the world of policy making, and thousands of economists in each country are working day and night to make tables like this, and then they have lots of models in the background and they sort of do their statistics. But they spend their lives doing this, and I had no idea that there were so many of them and that this is what they do, because I know no academic who does this. So we as academics have sort of been cut off from the reality that this is what policy economists do. Really? Okay. So I'm trying to tell you about something that I was ignorant about even 5 years ago, just how important this kind of methodology is. So I'm going to talk you through it. I'm going to talk you through it slowly, but I will first draw your attention to the fact that this thing claims that the total benefits of this new runway under CT, which is carbon traded, which basically, they want to appear green. So carbon traded means they presume some sort of low international price for carbon. That's their preferred scenario. They also have carbon capped, which basically to them means that Heathrow can't grow too much, and they want to show that that costs £23 billion, which is their way of saying we shouldn't do carbon capping, and indeed there will be no carbon capping. But the total benefits in this thing are 69 billion, and they've got lots of things here which they mention. Red basically means, yes, this is bad for the UK, but there's not a number, and so the only number that is there in the benefits is 69 billion, and in the conclusions of their report, which is a nice big report, you know, 150 pages and lots of appendages, they say, well, against the object of maximizing the economic benefits, this runway option performs most strongly, generating 69.1 billion of benefits. So this also defines economic benefits as the things you can count. Right? Note here that economic benefits is everything in there, and all the red and green stuff is just, well, we can't count it, so it's not an economic benefit. Right? And that's the first point to make, because most of sustainable development is in that red bit. Right? And this is where you lose. This is where your agenda is basically put into a side note and said, you know, you don't matter because it's not counted. And so if you're not in the business of trying to become counted in terms of pounds, you lose. You just end up in a table as, yeah, well, there's that, but we don't know how much it's worth, so it's not going to matter. Right? At least not for what is called the economic benefit here. Right? Now, let me walk you through a few things. Right? The headline numbers here are consumer surplus and producer surplus. Now, producer surplus is roughly speaking profit, and even though this is basically paid for by the producers, the argument here is that the new runway is going to cost effectively 40 billion in producer surplus. Now, you think, how is that possible? Persons who pay for this thing say they're going to lose 40 billion. Well, you see, it's the airport who wants to do this. And they think the 40 billion is going to come from airlines who are going to charge much lower prices as the capacity of Heathrow is expanded. So they basically think there's another 40 billion of profits to be squeezed out of airlines, which is a bit unusual because airlines don't make much profit at all. So this is a little bit probably wishful thinking, but there's a nice big model in the background, all dynamic and multiple markets, you know. Let's trust them for the moment. And the big plus thing here is consumer surplus. And the interesting thing about consumer surplus is basically the area under a demand curve, is that we're not talking about, as it were, you know, a price, a visible thing that consumers get. This is, as it were, presumed utility. So this is like well-being, right? This is basically willingness to pay minus price. And note that that's not observed, so it's inferred, right? This is their inferred measure for happiness, for well-being. So we can fight about our preferred measure for well-being, meanwhile this dominates policy land. So, you know, there is something to be said for going with the best of what we have at the moment and pushing that and leaving the question for what is perfect for a longer run debate. Okay, now this is sort of, you know, a little demand supply diagram. So there's a capacity constraint now. Heathrow is going to expand. If it expands, then, you know, that's the marginal cost line, the demand curve. Of the consumer market, then supposedly the price will go from P1 to P2 in some sense, and then there's sort of a loss of profit A, and there's an increase in profit B, and there's an extra C, so the consumers get the AC bit and the producers get the B minus A bit. So, you know, there's lots of further nuances to be said, but that's roughly speaking the type of thinking they have. Now, I want to make a couple of notes about this, because I want to take you through the logic of this to also show you how evolutionary this kind of methodology is and how it has picked up habits from different centuries and different decades. Right? This is not a single methodology. So, first note is this notion of consumer surplus is not observed. It's willingness to pay minus price, deduced from estimated demand curves. Right? Now, that in itself is 19th century partial equilibrium thinking. It is, contrary to conventional wisdom, not marginal, but it comes from France. So this is French, sort of 1850 partial equilibrium thinking. And so this is where we see part of the 19th century, right? And these numbers come from particular airport demand supply models, you know, particularly chosen, of course, to sort of get the numbers that the airport commission wanted. Lots of calibrations, lots of shoot parameters. The second note to make is that the airport owners, there are Swiss companies, want this extension. They think they'll make money over this, and so they've paid part of the Capex here, and I'm going to go back to this table a lot. So this is the scheme Capex and surface access cost. That bit, that basically means that's how much it will cost to make this actual runway, right? Which largely consists of building up the houses and putting up the runway type thing. And that's the 16 billion, and that's not put up there in terms of the further cost. But part of that Capex will have to come from the Swiss company. So they're willing to pay a large slice of the 16 billion because they think they can get higher prices somewhere, right? And those higher prices somewhere should be deduced from the consumer surplus, but they've not been. This is buried somewhere in you know, page 100, but what effectively is going on here is that consumer surplus is artificially inflated in order to make it seem like the consumers are going to get a big deal, right? It's only at the back of the report you realize, oh, they're not going to get that. They're not even going to get half of that. That is all supposed to be taken away from them in terms of higher charges. But they don't want that for their headlines, because then the total benefits will only look the half. So they basically smuggle in lots of costs outside of this table. Okay, so that's the second note, right? So what you are seeing is advocacy. This is how lobbying is done, right? It is done by making particular assumptions, burying them somewhere deep in a report, and having a nice table in which it seems as if everybody's going to win. Now, note 3, they have estimates in there for what the extra cost will be of noise and of air quality. Well, where does that come from? That comes from physical health. So there is a large literature on how noise and air pollution affects physical health, and they pick their numbers from that. And the key thing to note is that if you look at mental health, the actual effect of both noise and air pollution are far higher. So they've cherry-picked. They've cherry-picked a notion of health, meaning physical health, to get a low number for the noise cost and a low number for the air pollution cost, right? That is what happens if you don't have an advocated headline thing which you say is important. Then in the background, people just make their own assumptions which suits them, right? So this is what you get with a dashboard. If you say, oh, all kinds of health matter and we don't want to choose, fine, you don't choose, they will choose for you. And they have chosen a particular one to make sure that the noise and the air pollution effect are as small as they possibly can be. Right? They also downplay the evidence of well-being. Right? So they've got some sort of, they make remarks about noise and well-being, because we know noise is pretty bad for well-being. But they basically cherry-pick counter-studies with, as it were, unusual measures of well-being, namely these kind of experience sample methods under which you get very little effect of noise. So they also cherry-pick the well-being measures out there, right? So they basically play us as a field, right? They basically say, there's an enormous crowd of people who have different indices. I'm going to pick the one which happens to be good for this item in my table. And they pick a different one for a different item in the table, right? So they cherry-pick. This is how it's done, right? This is how you win in statistics like that, right? Now, note 4a, the wider economic impacts, right? That is here, right? The wider economic impacts, they're basically the only thing that makes this program worthwhile at all. And that's essentially additional tourists, which would come in via Heathrow, and they would sort of fill up some of the hotels. Now, I want you to note something of that, because that is not standard economic thinking to put that in. Right? From a macro perspective, if you have more tourism, you have less something else, because your workers are then in the tourism industry, and they're not producing something else. So from a macro perspective, there's no way that that would be worth so much. So this, again, is partial economic thinking, but it's not commensurate with some of their own models on macroeconomic thinking. So there again, you sort of see advocacy in terms of the subtle assumptions made on how much you get in as a country from tourism. Right? And I may note that this basically violates the Department of Trade's own guidelines as to how to do this, but you know, it's politics, you get away with it. Right? And so that's one of the different ones that they come in about. Now, I want to make another couple of points, right? Which is something that is easy to miss if you see tables like this, right? So, which is that government revenue is put on a one-on-one basis with consumer surplus, it's put on a one-on-one basis with the Capex cost. A lot of that would also be borne by the government. Now what that means is that pounds are added together. If you know, that's logical, isn't it? No, it's not. And it's not economic thinking either. So this means, effectively, that what the government gets to spend has no higher utility on average than what individuals get to spend, anywhere in the economy. So this is an assumption that the marginal utility of any form of spending or revenue is exactly equal in all sectors. Now that is not economic thinking. Economic thinking is much more, well, there's a point to government. Surely the total, at least average utility of government spending is probably much higher than individual spending because there's a bit of sort of disutility and sort of deadweight loss of more taxes. So this is a very odd assumption to just add these pounds together. As economists, you'd more want to add the utility that these various forms of expenditure buy, right? And so you think, where does that come from? Where does this assumption that you can just add these pounds up rather than have some notion of, well, what do these pounds buy in terms of utility or well-being? Where did that come in? That's not economics at all. Well, that is essentially GDP statistical thinking. This is Y is C plus G plus I type thinking. That is 1940s Kuznets, right? That is more so kind of thinking, well, they're all pounds, so surely we can just add them together. Even though that's not a standard economic way of looking at reality at all, right? And so this is where the 1940s and 50s come in. So we've already seen, as it were, the 19th century in here. There's another big habit in here, which is just you add all these pounds together, you don't look at what they buy, you don't look at the utility that they're supposed to buy, right? So this is also where a lot of well-being stuff basically loses, right? Because the answer to what government is for, whether it's any good to sort of increase the well-being for the population is answered, which is no, it's no good at all. In fact, it would be equally better off if there is no government, right? Because in the hands of consumers it all buys an equal amount of utility. So there are enormous assumptions made in the habits of these cost-benefit analyses, which are neither economics, nor well-being, nor sustainable development. But the crucial thing to say is that these are standard assumptions. This is how it's done in France, this is how it's done here in the Treasury, this is how it's done in Germany, this is how it's done in the US. And this is a little bit like a leaking bucket, which has sort of been cobbled up together over many decades in order to get at numbers for any policy you want. And so this is the leaking bucket that should sort of be our target. We should engage with this leaking bucket and say, well, we can plug some of the holes, we can do better on various aspects of it. Right? This kind of leaking bucket, what is cost-benefit analysis, which is lots and lots of assumptions which are incompatible to each other. They don't come out of a single framework. They've got some general equilibrium thinking, some partial equilibrium thinking, some statistical thinking. Well, that leaking bucket has come together because treasuries, departments need a reason to give money to one thing and not the other thing. You know, this comes out of budget wars. And if there are any heads of department in here, then they know budget wars determine almost anything in a university or almost anything anywhere in the world, right? And so these budget wars have led to this kind of methodology. So this is where inclusive growth agenda is downplayed. Right? This is where we lose at the moment because we're totally oblivious of this. I had no idea that there was this whole world of sort of 1980s economic thinking so dominant in policy land, and this is where a lot of my best students would end up, and they would sort of make these tables for private and government clients. Right? And so note 5 is that what is not measured does not count. Right? It really is true. What is not measured does not count. And so there is, I think there's sort of great value in trying to count some things which are not yet. Negative externalities on the environment will give us a number, you know, how much, put it in pounds, put it in dollars, right? If you think about community disruption of this runway, don't say there is community disruption, put a number to it. It's worth 2 billion, 3 billion, whatever the most reasonable number is, but come up with a methodology so that you can start plugging numbers into tables like this. So the reflections, this is steeped in GDP logic, economic thinking of the 1980s, and these assumptions are normal in many Western bureaucracies. I didn't realize that until I saw tables of all kinds of rules of thumb as to what discount rates to use in here, or what a reasonable assumption is on how much an hour of commuting is worth. And this is literally how economics is made inside departments. This is how the sausage is made. Right? And so this is also a bureaucratic battleground, and this is where we must be. Right? This is in which well-being can add value because we can plug a lot more numbers, in principle, into these kind of things, and we can replace a lot of these methodologies, right? So in well-being thinking, you wouldn't add up these pounds, you would add up well-beings. And so you would try and get an estimate for, well, how much well-being does each of the elements in this kind of table buy us, right? You have a totally different mindset if you come from well-being than if you come from this kind of reality. Right? So it's also clear that this thing is evolutionary. It won't be swiped away in one go. As in any evolution, you've got to bring in new things into this cost-benefit methodology. You've got to, as it were, pick the points at which you think you can change something and add something, because this is not going to be swept away. You know, we can all sort of agree that it's idiotic, but it's there for a purpose, and it's not going to go away. It may be augmented, improved, but it's not going to disappear. So to have policy effect, if we're going to have policy effect as a well-being community, we must be this. We must be in this, right? And we must make suggestions towards it. Right, so on that latter point, suggestions towards it, I want to bring out one of the points of the well-being literature, also sort of the inclusive growth literature. This is the old point about the Eastman Paradox, and I'm going to skim it because I'm presuming that you're all familiar with it and mostly on board, right? And in terms of, well, what should we bring in it, I want to start with a claim from Adam Smith, because he had this great claim about vanity, which you can also think of status and consumption externalities. And he said the great secret of education is to direct vanity to proper objects. Now I think it's a fantastic quote because it's two things, right? It's one, it just presumes vanity is there, right? There's a status seeking, this is just human, evolutionary hardwired. He just accepts it as, okay, this is out there. Now that's a big thing. There is no status in anywhere of that cost-benefit analysis. There's no consumption externalities. One of the other hidden assumptions is people don't affect each other. There's no such thing as society in these cost-benefit analyses. It's just individuals, you can add everything on together. There's nothing between them, right? And so this notion of vanity, that my consumption negatively affects yours, is not in the cost-benefit analysis. And my big question, and that's what the Eastman discount is for, is how to put it in. So, but not only did Adam Smith recognize that vanity is there, but he also thought we can change it. We can direct it. We could say, yes, you should fight for the glory of the fatherland, or you should sort of be a proper citizen, or you should have a well-paying job, or you should be a good friend, right? He very much thought that we could shape vanity by what we openly value, what we openly give prizes towards, what we nudge people towards. So, as with the implication that the second is totally not well understood yet in economics and social science, but the second is very, very policy relevant as well. But it's the first thing that I'm going to talk about here, right? Which is just, okay, there is such a thing as vanity, by which I'm also going to mean status seeking, right? But I would like you to reflect on, well, okay, if we can direct vanity, how would you do it towards what, right? If you see it as a given, then, and think of it as an engineering problem, what would you do? Okay, now I'm going to hope this thing works. Because this is, it's not my video, but it's a fantastic video. Okay. Now many of you will have seen this thing, but it's fantastic.
Getting great, you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests her rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Right. Now, what is the point of this thing? The point of this thing, there we go.
I guess it's another YouTube video.
God, really? Okay.
See that? It must be
Logan knows, but well, he and Lee
Somebody's playlist is now being covered.
just did the exact same trick.
Now, what was the point of that video? that video is a nice example of how other monkeys than us are also into status. Into status in the sense that the monkey on the left was perfectly fine to do something for a cucumber until he saw that another monkey, for the same task, got a grape, which is much nicer. And suddenly the cucumber wasn't enough anymore. He was really angry at just being offered a cucumber. Now that's a classic consumption externality. The value of the cucumber has gone down because of what somebody else has. Perfect externality, but also he's angry. There's a direct externality there as well, which is, you know, he's sort of less happy because of the cucumber now than he used to be. Now, that sort of thing is ubiquitous in the animal world, right? This also holds for wolves and dogs. All kinds of social animals have that kind of thing. There are lots and lots of studies how we humans are like this. If somebody in the neighborhood buys a car, then we're more likely to buy a car as well, because we don't want to be too much without a new car. There's also a famous experiment now in Norway where people knew what the income was of their neighbors, and then the kids started to talk about it at school, and income started to be lots more important. This became such a problem in Norway that the tax authorities shut down this information device. There's sort of, you know, other GDP type stuff in there. And really what I want to say is that status concerns are probably evolutionary hardwired. Any animal that doesn't do this is going to lose out in sort of relative comparisons. We now know neural pathways in which we very, very quickly pick up what other people like us have, and then we readjust our norms to what we find normal and what we want to sort of take account of that. Right? So I think the evidence for this kind of stuff is just overwhelming that there is a large negative consumption externality. Right? This is the Easterlin discount, this is status seeking, this is where, you know, taxes on status goods come in. Right? And the question is, okay, if you accept this, how do we bring this into classic cost-benefit analysis? How would you do it? Right? And so I have 5 minutes, but I want you to think a minute yourself, well, what rule of thumb would you advocate to be added to current cost-benefit habits as practiced in many countries? And if you're going to come back to me with, well, I first want to know this, I first want to know that, what do you mean? That means the status quo wins. Any indefinite answer means the status quo wins. So think for yourself, how would you do it? How would you bring this into cost-benefit analysis? Don't tell me the answer, but think about it. What would you do? What would you do? Okay, now I hope you have an answer for yourself, because that was sort of the question I posed myself, right? When I sort of figured out, okay, this is what these departments do, how can we bring one of the main building blocks of well-being analysis, one of the big findings in the literature, by one of our founders, you know, Richard Easterlin, how can we bring that into this practice of doing stuff? Well, that's where the Easterlin discount comes in, right? The idea of the Easterlin discount is that we should take a percentage reduction of the value counted for all forms of private market-mediated consumption above the welfare state minimum, right? And so, why the welfare state minimum? Because status vanity basically is anything above what all of us have, right? So we can't be jealous of something that belongs to all of us. We can't be jealous of this room because we're all in this room. We can't be jealous of national symbols because we all have the national symbols, right? But anything above that, anything that's above, as it were, a state-provided minimum, is something you can be jealous about. You can be jealous about holidays, you can be jealous about physical beauty, health, and that sort of stuff. And so the proposal that we make is to have an Easterlin discount, a percentage reduction in this kind of counted market value of all kinds of forms of consumption. Right? And the key thing is that if you make that kind of suggestion and you become serious about it, you're going to answer all kinds of, oh, but what about that thing? What about services? What about things which are basic comforts like pain, cold, noise, right? Well, probably not basic comforts, because there is a social norm that we shouldn't be afflicted by any of these things. So if there's that kind of social norm that we all should have something, then it basically you're going towards a floor where everybody does indeed have that, and so there's no more status to be had out of that. And effectively what I then do, this is part of that handbook, is I start playing with these numbers. And so this is now without the Easterlin discount, this is with the Easterlin discount, and the consumer surplus gets halved. 50% gets taken away. The producer surplus gets halved. 50% gets taken away. The wider economic impacts, that's the tourism, that's also going to be private consumption towards somebody, that value gets halved. But not noise, not air quality, not the carbon emissions, and not the government costs, because the government costs go at the expense of public goods, which are for all of us, and hence there's no status discount there either. It's not going to apply to taxes, because there again, that pays for something that is there for all of us, and it's not going to apply for government revenue. And then you get a net present value, which is much lower than it previously was. And so the point I want to make about this is that if you have, as it were, an Easterlin discount type view of the world, which is you want to bring these consumption externalities into standard cost benefit thinking, you can start engaging with lots of difficulties. You know, how about Capex? How about the revenue on that side? How about these kinds of goods and services? You can't run away from that. You must come up with a rule of thumb that covers all various eventualities as they are there. Right? Excellent. Right? I'm almost done. Right? So you need to make tricky decisions if you are going to engage with policy land. Right? And we sort of made these kind of tricky decisions. And can I then get this thing to sort of switch, you know, whether we should do this or not? Yes, I can. So if I make a general equilibrium assumption that there's no private economic impacts, i.e. the tourism in a general equilibrium sense doesn't buy us anything more, this just redirects resources towards caring about the tourist. So if I knock that one out, and I keep the Easterlin discount thing, then I can get a situation whereby previously you would do this, you think there's a net present value that is positive, and you would get a net present value that's negative if you don't apply the Easterlin discount. So we also can fiddle the numbers, and this is just purely for illustration, whether or not you should do this or not. Right. Now, this is basically, the lessons are the reality of policymaking is a very murky business. It's loaded against sustainable development, against well-being. This is where we lose and we must engage with it. Right? And the Easterlin discount hence unites various goals in a way, which is it's part of the things that you do if you're pro-sustainable development, but it's also something that you would do if you're pro-well-being. And in terms of where this kind of handbook thinking is going, in terms of how we should bring well-being into policy, this is ultimately where it's going. We've got on the left-hand side the notion of public costs, so this is pounds. And on the sort of the horizontal axis is going to be various interventions, and we basically have bang for the buck. Bang for the buck here is pounds per wellbeing, and a wellbeing is 1 unit of life satisfaction for one person for 1 year. Right? So there's both length in there and well-being in there. And you know, the NHS, which is the National Health Service, is seen then as the marginal cut-off point, and there are things which are more expensive than the NHS, and things which are less expensive than the NHS. And with the logic of this sort of thing, you'd want to fund everything that's below the NHS marginal and not fund anything above the NHS marginal. So that's the kind of thinking that we advocate going towards in terms of how well-being should be reflected into policy. Now that's it, right? So I've tried to give you a small glimmer of sort of the questions you have to engage with if you want to go and put well-being or your sustainable development things into actual policy making, right? If it's all about, we have a headline index and we compare that for countries, that's not policy making, right? You've got to get into the sausage making factory that is policy making now and try and think of rules of thumb to augment what they do. Questions?